James Arthur Musson, First Pass Biography Draft. Assembled 2026-3-2023-1031. Draft Note. This First Pass manuscript integrates 4 source streams kept distinct in the working files: Art's journals, Art's weekly family letters, Brodie McDermott's eyewitness report from September 29, 2015, and Michael Musson's posthumous remembrance. In the body text, Art's journals and letters carry his own voice. Brodie and Michael are used for external perspective and are identified as such where they enter the narrative. Prologue and Part 1 Roots. Prologue. I have decided to write a diary. On January 14, 1970, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, James Arthur Musson opened a school exercise book and began with a decision. I have decided to write a diary, he wrote. He hoped that someday he would be able to look back, remember what he had gone through, and smile. He added another hope, too, that his experiences might be of some value to others. That opening matters because it tells us what kind of record he meant to make. He was not only preserving events, he was trying to understand a life while he lived it, and to leave behind some account of how a person changes. Before turning to the day-to-day, he backed up to the beginning, as if he knew the present would make more sense if he first explained the boy he had been. His first pages are not polished autobiography. They are searching, self-critical, sometimes blunt, and sometimes unsure of themselves. He reread what he had written the next day and called it a mess, but he also clarified the purpose. He wanted to paint a picture of his emotional growth as best he could. That is the real beginning of this biography, not just the date and place, but the method. Art was trying to tell the truth about himself. Chapter 1. Melita, Shoal Lake, Fort St. John. Art began with names and places. He was born on November 4, 1947 in Melita, Manitoba, the son of John Percival Musson, an accountant with the Royal Bank of Canada, and Louise Logan Musson. He had one brother, Bill, 14 months older than he was. Of his father's people, he knew only fragments. A grandfather from London who came west in the early 1900s, a grandmother who followed from England to marry him, years in Simpson, Saskatchewan, and then Melita, Manitoba. In 1947, his grandparents retired to Port Coquitlam. His father's life, in Art's telling, had the plain shape of duty and work. He finished school, joined the bank, served in the RCAF, played trombone in the band, married, and returned to banking. Transfers moved the family first to Shoal Lake and then in 1953 to Fort St. John, where Art's parents remained. About his mother's family, he said almost nothing. They were back east, mostly unknown to him. That absence is part of the portrait, too. Art's account of his origins is detailed in some places and blank in others, as family memory often is. The childhood memories he chose were not sentimental ones. He said he remembered little of Melita. What stayed with him were odd, vivid, guilty things. Taking knives from a friend, accidentally killing a cat, stealing a dog, stealing cigarettes, and smoking them. He thought he and his brother were generally well behaved under their father's strict hand, but he did not present himself as innocent. From the start, his self-portrait included both conscience and confession. Chapter 2. A shy boy in a demanding world. Fort St. John gave him what he called mixed emotional memories. Outwardly, much of it sounded unremarkable enough. He did well in school. He had normal likes and dislikes. He worked young, first in a small store, then with a paper route, and by 15 he was working after school and in summers for a firm of chartered accountants. Most extras in the family, he wrote, had to be earned. But the inner story was harder. He was very thin, and around 15 he became shy and quiet. He thought he was afraid to really try at things in case he failed. Looking back, he wondered whether more encouragement and trust from his father might have helped. He was careful even there, saying not that his father did not love them, but that the bank kept him busy, and much of the child raising fell to his mother. What Art felt he missed most was trust, the everyday confidence shown when a father lets a child handle tools, responsibilities, the small proofs of competence. That combination mattered. He was capable, working, observant, and not without ambition. But he was also fragile in the way young men can be when their self-worth depends too much on how they imagine they look to others. Much of what followed grew out of that tension between ability and fear. Chapter 3. Going Astray. When Art came to 1964, his language sharpened. In 1964, I went astray. He was 16, afraid of girls, and sensitive to teasing. One summer night, after saying he was going to bed in the back shed, he slipped out instead. He met an older friend in the alley, went driving, and found himself pulled into a world that felt unlike the shy, obedient role he had known. He kept going back. Drinking, smoking, and nightly escapades followed. He thought he may have stayed with that crowd because he did not want to be thought a sissy. He saw the consequences clearly in retrospect. His schoolwork suffered. His job suffered. By April 1965, failing grade 12, he was let go from the accounting firm. He fought his parents' authority, drifted further, and later described himself with brutal compactness, drinking, smoking, skinny, shy, and still deeply uncertain of himself. The future he had imagined, becoming a chartered accountant, seemed to collapse with his failure at school. The picture was not all ruin. He had bought a small Honda with savings, learned trumpet, played in the town band, taken up golf. But even these accomplishments could not steady him. What he remembered most was the loss of direction and the damage to his standards, ideals, and self-respect. He did not think the problem was incapacity. He thought it was a lack of understanding, love, and a nearly killing worry over what his peers thought of him. Work continued. A janitor's job, then a stint at IG Labs, then a return to the old firm. In 1968, he was transferred to Dawson Creek. His boss, Russ Daniluk, comes through in the account as a rare figure of patience, someone who encouraged him even when his work had deteriorated and chose transfer over firing. Art did not romanticize what happened next. Homesick, self-pitying, still choosing badly, he was fired in April 1969. Then came the break. Too proud to go back to Fort St. John, he headed south with $90 in his pocket and $1,800 in debt, unsure where he was going or what he would do. He had believed too much in the symbols of self-worth, in the car, the clothes, the job, the professional image. Losing them felt like losing the last crutch holding him up. By the end of that first long retrospective, he had brought the story to the edge of the turn. He was in Port Coquitlam, staying with his grandfather, broke in debt, and still searching. Soon he would meet 2 missionaries in the backyard. Soon the diary would leave background behind and become a record of daily life, faith, and change. Turning Point. Chapter 4. January 1970. Once Art finished his long backward glance, the diary settled into days. The first weeks of 1970 are full of daily entries, and that is part of their value. He slept late, visited his grandfather in the hospital, bought jeans and runners, watched TV, practiced trumpet, read scripture, went to scouts, attended family home evening, and spent time with bereaved and friends. Snow and slush, errands and supper, rides to Vancouver, a dance, a walk to church. The life on the page becomes immediate and local after the big retrospective sweep. Underneath the routine details, though, he was measuring himself almost every day. On January 15th, he wrote that he still had the old bad habit of being lazy and lost interest too quickly in projects. A week later, he said his testimony had strengthened, though he could not quite explain why. On January 25th, after walking partway to church, he wrote that things were becoming a little clearer, but he still did not know what direction to go in earning money. By February 4th, the 2 pressures sat side by side in one sentence. His financial position was getting worse and worse, but his testimony was growing. The money trouble was real. He wrote of static from the Royal Bank and Simpsons threatening to sue. With the car in the garage, he had his first day on foot and found it changed his point of view. He made a hitchhiking sign from shoe polish and an old piece of sheet with New West on one side and Port Co on the other, and was almost comically successful. Hardly had he held it out before a car stopped, both going and coming back. There is no self-pity in the entry, only observation. He was broke enough to feel cornered, but alert enough to notice what the loss of convenience taught him. The church gave those weeks a second center of gravity. He bore his testimony in fast and testimony meeting and felt good afterward. He prepared a family home evening lesson on saving. He went home teaching, washed floors at the church, attended institute, read the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, and kept trying to understand what humility, righteousness, and spiritual prompting required of him in practice. Sometimes he felt buoyant, progressing fabulously spiritually. Sometimes he was down in the mouth, felt out of place at a dance, or thought everything was falling apart. On February 13th, he sat moping at a dance until Barit asked him for a polka and pulled him out of the mood. By the end of the night, several girls had asked him to dance. The diary holds both states without smoothing them over. Barit is there from the beginning too, not yet as the center of the story, but as a steady presence entering the days one visit, walk, dance, or evening at a time. Grandpa is there as well, in hospital visits, crib games, dependence for food and shelter, and the delicate friction of living close to another person while trying to become one himself. The diary's daily form lets these relationships emerge naturally through repetition. What he was really recording in January 1970 was not just activity, it was formation. He was trying to become less lazy, less vain, less reactive, more useful, more faithful, more governed from the inside. He did not yet know what career to undertake. He did not yet have his debts solved, his moods mastered, or his future sorted out. But he had a practice now. Write the day down, examine it, and try again tomorrow. Chapter 5. Conversion and Direction. In his opening retrospective, Art put the decisive turn in plain terms. After leaving Dawson Creek and coming south, he was in Port Coquitlam with his grandfather, in debt, out of work, and waiting on a job prospect that never came. Then, one day in early June, 2 Mormon missionaries came into the backyard while he and his grandfather were sitting in the sun. To that point, he said, his religious life had been almost nil. He had been baptized and confirmed Anglican, but since about age 12 had gone to church fewer than a dozen times. He listened partly because he was not busy, and the missionaries were about his age. He did not imagine himself becoming like them. But he listened again, met local members, and was eventually baptized. He did not claim instant certainty. In fact, one of the most persuasive things in his account is its gradualness. He wrote that he was not completely sold at first. What he could see was that these people had a different kind of life than he did, and it looked better, so he decided to give it a 3-month try. He believed that if he had still been surrounded by the old crowd, their contempt might have stopped him. In Port Coquitlam, with fewer people around to sneer, he endured. By January and February 1970, conversion was no longer only a past event. It was becoming a way of interpreting daily life. He spoke of his testimony strengthening, of following the promptings of the Spirit, of learning line upon line, of trying to be humble, of gaining a testimony of prayer, of seeing that the church helps people help themselves. He linked the gospel to practical things too. Tolerance, hard work, the desire to learn, a different standard for judging people, a less brittle self-image. He could be exacting about it, even severe with himself. He worried about bad thoughts, weakness, pride, laziness, moodiness, and whether he was doing a good job in his callings. He could sound elated one day and discouraged the next. But that oscillation was not a failure of conversion. It was the texture of it. He was not describing a man instantly remade. He was describing a man being changed over time. Late in that first retrospective, he tried to summarize the transformation as a move from negative thinking to positive thinking in the church. The phrasing is simple, maybe too simple for all that it contained. What it meant in practice was larger. He had found a foundation for his ideals, a community to belong to, a language for self-correction, and a reason to believe his life could be ordered towards something better than image, appetite, or drift. The next stage, he thought, would be figuring out his relation to the world and what career to pursue without becoming married to a job. That question remained open, but the direction of travel had changed. The diary's daily entries, with all their repetition and imperfection, are the record of that change taking hold. Building a life. Chapter 6. Marriage, Home, and Work. The middle of Art's life is not best told as a chain of dramatic turns. It is better understood as a life being built, one practical decision at a time. By the mid-1970s, the diary had become a record of shared life with Barit. Work, errands, church, family, and the practical business of making a home. In 1976, they were thinking seriously about buying a house. Art wrote about mortgage rules, septic tanks, monthly payments, borrowing from his father, and the strange combination of hope and arithmetic that comes with trying to buy a place of your own. In August, after one house seemed lost and then came back on the market when the buyer died, They made an offer. 2 days later, he recorded the news with plain excitement. Their offer had been accepted. The marriage itself had been prepared in the same mixture of feeling and practicality. In a 2009 anniversary letter, Art copied out old journal notes for the children. Root beer at A&W, milkshakes after a Christmas concert, a stuffed dog that barely fit in the car, a long talk about marriage at Bob's Burgers, Chinese food at the rickshaw, asking Ed Taranger's approval, and giving Berit her ring at Queen Elizabeth Park while it was snowing. The romance in his telling is never abstract. It lives in errands, meals, jokes, and decisions. The trip to be married in the Cardston Temple gave the story one of its sharpest turns. East of Osoyoos, they hit black ice, skidded off the road, struck a tree, and came to rest down a small embankment. Berit was shaken and bumped her head. Art, asleep in the back, slid forward and cracked one vertebra in his neck and chipped another. What followed was a chain of help. Strangers getting them to Osoyoos, a doctor and an x-ray in Oliver, local church members taking in Berit, Don and Sister Bailey turning up by what Art called very good fortune, then Penticton, a flight to Calgary, and a few days with the Clarks in Claresholm before the wedding went ahead on November 19, 1974. The accident did not become the center of the story. It became part of the way the marriage began, with disruption, help, persistence, and a blessing he remembered as very special. The details mattered to him. He wrote down the price, the expected payments, the second mortgage, the taxes, the money owed to his father. He was not only celebrating a milestone, he was trying to understand whether the life he wanted could be made to balance on paper. That practical attention runs through the years. Work was not an abstraction in Art's journals. It arrived as tax season, payroll, reconciliations, software changes, client files, and the effort to be ready before the busy months hit. He could be pleased when a tax season was over or when he felt better prepared than the year before. He could also sound worn down by backlog and unfinished work. The pattern is steady rather than glamorous. Responsibility accepted, managed, repeated. Home had the same texture. Painting, refinishing, stacking wood, cutting lawn, working in the garden, rebuilding a deck, tending the yard, making space in the freezer, cooking soup, drying tents, cleaning up storm debris. In the journals, and later in the weekly letters, domestic life is not background. It is one of the main ways character appears. In 1980, on a payday before a trip to Fort St. John, he took Dawn and Michael for a bike ride after supper. Then the family stopped at Dairy Queen for ice cream after checking the garden. He was also anxious about the drive, remembering an earlier accident and past car trouble, because he loved the family too much to bear the thought of them suffering. That combination of ice cream and worry is very much the man in these pages. What emerges is not a man chasing novelty, but a man committed to stewardship of money, house, work, and the small systems that keep a family going. Chapter 7, Fatherhood and Family Life. Family entered the diary first as anticipation and then as fact. In March 1970, Art had a dream that he was married to Berit and that they had twin boys. It reads now like an almost comic glimpse of the future breaking into the present. By January 1976, he was writing that Dawn Michelle Musson had been blessed in sacrament meeting. In March 1977, he recorded the birth of their first son just before midnight, grateful that Berit's labor had gone well enough, and already folding the event into the larger rhythm of work, hospital, and family care. From there, the story widens. Children are everywhere in the middle years, not as a tidy list of milestones, but as the daily weather of a household. There are blessings, shots, babysitters, school concerns, visits to grandparents, trips, weddings, adult children under financial strain, children spread across different places, and later grandchildren entering the scene. The journals often mention these things briefly, almost in passing, which is itself revealing. Family life was not an occasional subject, it was the medium he lived in. The weekly letters, beginning in 2007, make that family world more explicit. In his first one, Art admitted he was not very good at communicating and usually let Berit handle that department for both of them. The weekly email was his attempt to change. He joked that it would be an American Motors letter, a rambler, and that although he did not have much to say about himself, it would somehow still be all about him. The joke lands because it is only half true. Those letters are full of other people: children, grandchildren, siblings, in-laws, friends, ward members, scouts, and neighbors. As the children grew, his role changed, but did not lessen. He wrote about visits from Dawn and Mark and their families, about Matthew's wedding, about adult children in transition, about grandchildren and scattered schedules, about the pleasure of having everyone gathered and the durable concern that follows children into adulthood. The form of fatherhood altered over time. The habit of attention did not. Michael's remembrance adds the child's eye view the journals often leave out. He remembered Art becoming, over years and 4 sons in Cubs, a master Cub car builder, eventually running a test track through the basement from one end of the house to the other, so that Michael had to duck under it to get to his room at night. He remembered one-on-one hikes, including Black Tusk, where fear stopped him at the chimney, until Art tied them together with a rope and went first. And he remembered standing in sport checks staring at a $400 Kemper snowboard, expecting to be turned down, only to have his father agree if Michael paid half. Only years later did he understand what that purchase must have cost. There is a temptation in biography to make family life sound like a sequence of big events. Art's papers argue for something truer and less tidy. A father is also made in rides, errands, meals, worries, home projects, phone calls, letters, and showing up. Chapter 8. Seasons. Across decades, Art's writing returns to the same rhythms so often that they become a kind of structure. There is tax season coming around each year with its pressure and satisfaction. There is the garden and yard, the lawn and raspberries and zucchini, the boulevard and deck and the state of the weather. There are holidays, trips, family visits, scout camps, church meetings, and the small pleasure of a good meal after work done. There are winters noted for snow or mildness, summers for heat and dryness, rain arriving at last, and the satisfaction of getting something in order before the next change in season. The repetition is not a flaw to be edited away completely. It is part of what makes the life legible. Art's world was built from recurrence. He paid attention to the same kinds of things year after year because those were the things a life was made of. Work completed, service rendered, family fed, a house kept up, weather endured, a calling done as well as he knew how. The weekly letters sharpen this seasonal quality. A single letter might move from scout camp to crabapple jelly, from windstorm cleanup to chilliwack corn, from computer problems at Elgin to soup made from turkey bones. They are ramblers, as he promised, but they ramble along the paths he knew best. They show a man whose sense of meaning was not separate from routine. It was carried by routine. One Sunday in June 2007 catches the pattern whole. After church and choir practice, he helped Barrett with Matt's birthday dinner. Matt and Sarah were there, joined by Jordan and Miley, Aaron, Mike, and Linda. Art listed the menu like a man who wanted the children who were absent to be able to taste the evening anyway. Roast potatoes, broccoli, cauliflower with cheese sauce, peas and carrots, broccoli salad, steaks on the barbecue, strawberry blout cake for dessert. "You should have been here," he wrote. Then came dishes with Barrett, emails at the computer, and the kids in the front room drinking mate and talking. That is as good a portrait as any of the life he built. The point is the accumulation. Year after year, Art kept working, serving, repairing, planting, writing, worrying, joking, and making room for other people. The life was built there. Service and stewardship. Chapter 9. Temple, Scouts, and Community. If the middle of Art's life was built in maintenance, it was also built in service. From the early 1970s onward, the journals show church responsibility becoming one of the fixed structures of his week. Home teaching, family home evening, scouts, youth work, bishopric meetings, ward clerk duties, temple recommends, and later temple service itself. He did not write about these things as a man collecting rolls. He wrote about them as work to be done, lessons to absorb, and obligations that exposed his weaknesses as much as his strengths. That is one of the most consistent things in the record. Service was never a platform for self-congratulation. It was a place where he kept discovering the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be. In 1971, after Guides and Scouts, he wrote that to discipline others, he had to be able to discipline himself. In 1972, newly acting in the capacity of ward clerk, he said he loved the job. Elsewhere, he worried over doing a poor job, not being organized enough, not communicating well enough, not quite living up to a calling's demands. The callings mattered because they asked him to grow. Scouting runs through the decades as both labor and joy. There are early camps, planning meetings, weather problems, boys too wound up to sleep, and the practical logistics of getting everyone through an outing. In the 2013 weekly letter from Harrison Lake, he described a camp with the ease of long experience. Sessions, cleanup, road repair, lake work, environmental projects, old scouter friends, a campfire program pulled together without enough advanced preparation, and boys who needed a firm line the first night. After asking them politely several times to go to sleep, he finally read the riot act, scared them quiet, and used earplugs the next nights. The tone is affectionate, competent, and unsentimental. He knew the work from the inside. Temple service appears similarly, less as a grand declaration than as a steady commitment. By 2013, he could write that temple going was great. One November evening, he recorded it in the same practical key he used for everything else. He and Berit enjoyed their shift at the temple, and Mike Todd was the new assistant coordinator and trainer, keen and likely to do a good job. He also noted acting as shift coordinator when another brother had health problems, and he and Berit are there again and again in the record, going to the temple, taking shifts, doing the quiet, repetitive work that almost never makes dramatic biography, but often makes a life. What ties these strands together is not one title or one institution. It is the habit of stewardship. Art kept showing up, learned, corrected himself, and came back the next week. Chapter 10. Children grown, family expanding. As the children became adults, the family story broadened rather than thinned. The journals and letters are full of motion. Visits, weddings, trips, grandchildren, airport pickups, changing jobs, tight finances, health worries, and the logistics of families now spread across more than one place. In December 2013, Art recorded Eric's arrival from Guatemala. Matt, Taryn, Berit, Art, and Taryn's parents met him at the airport. The next day, Berit and Art drove into Vancouver, picked up Matt and Eric, and went to Value Village, Real Canadian Superstore, and Walmart to shop for clothes and other things he would need, then stopped for lunch at Wendy's. It is a small scene, but a telling one. Arrival made practical immediately. Love expressed as welcome and provisioning. That same broadening family appears elsewhere in quick, crowded glimpses. After Matthew's August 2013 wedding, many family members were there. Dawn and family and Laura Lee and family stayed another week and a half. Jared a couple of days before flying back to work. Mark a week before doing the same. In 2014, he noted visits from Dawn and Jane and children, and from Mark, Loma Lee and children. These entries are brief, but behind their brevity is the obvious pleasure of a family still actively joined to one another. He also wrote about the adult burdens his children carried. Mark opening his medical practice in Corvallis and struggling to build patient flow. Dawn and Jared's finances being tight. Matthew having a hard few months with health issues, including some depression. Art does not inflate these into speeches. He records them as a father does when concern has become part of daily consciousness. The weekly letters made room for the wider family circle too. They move easily from one household to another, from local errands to news of siblings, in-laws, cousins, and grandchildren. They preserve a man still attentive to the lives branching out from his own, still reporting, encouraging, noticing, and staying in touch. By then, his fatherhood was less about directing children than about witnessing and supporting adults. The love is no less active for being less central in the old, practical ways. It takes the form of updates, visits, help, worry, and delight. Chapter 11. Aging, Health, and Reflection. In the later entries, age enters quietly. There are small physical notes across the years. Blood pressure up somewhat, a shoulder bothering him, medical appointments, blood work, the plain signs of a body becoming less ignorable. By September 2015, he wrote more directly that he had been having health issues for several months. Not particular pain, but unfamiliar discomfort, with stomach trouble and a colonoscopy somewhere ahead. He put it plainly and moved on. That plainness is important. The journals do not turn aging into a separate drama. Health sits beside everything else: work, family, garden, weather, church, errands, and the next camp to prepare for. Even in late August and early September 2015, the weekly letters are full of activity. He and Berit attend Theo van Gogh's funeral and are still in the cultural hall for refreshments when the lights go out. Before the wind dies down, he reports, 500,000 people in the lower mainland are without power. They creep along the freeway past fallen branches to Chilliwack, buy triple sweet Jubilee corn, come home to test the generators, then spend the next week cleaning up storm mess, doing a church cleaning assignment, helping with house painting, making supper for family, attending scout leadership camp, and preparing for another camp. The evidence of aging is there, but so is momentum. Reflection deepens too. He notices what he can and cannot control, what habits still need work, what service asks of him, what family means as children and grandchildren grow, and how daily life continues to carry spiritual weight. If the younger Art wrote in order to track emotional growth, the older Art seems to have found a form for living with less strain against himself. Not perfectly, not without worry, but with steadier acceptance. The final September sequence follows naturally from that pattern. He was still working, still serving, still writing, still planning the next activity. The late life chapters are not a tapering off. They are a continuation, right up to the edge. Young Men, Chapter 12, Outside My Comfort Zone. On September 13, 2015, Art's journal still moved in the familiar pattern of his life. Family news, dry weather, work around the house, a son out hunting, a nearly paid-off mortgage, a recent scouting camp, a new bishop. Then he came to the change that would define his last weeks. He had been called as Young Men's president. He wrote that it would be a challenge, a bit out of my comfort zone, but added at once that he loved the young men and expected both fun and frustration. After 8 years as a scout leader, the calling was not a departure from his life so much as a deepening of it. In the same entry, he noted that he had been having health issues for several months. No sharp pain but unfamiliar discomfort, some stomach trouble, and a colonoscopy somewhere ahead. He did not make it dramatic. He set it down in the middle of daily concerns, the way he recorded most things, as one more fact to carry alongside duty, family, and faith. His weekly letters from the next 2 Sundays widened that picture. On September 20th, he told the family he was no longer a scout leader and had moved up to work with the older boys, the venturers, while also serving as Young Men's president. He sounded energized by it. He knew these boys already. He had worked with them before. He was looking ahead to camp, to combined activities, to whatever excitement the older boys would find over the next few years. The letter was practical and cheerful, full of the usual details of food drive work, a stolen visa number, phone calls to make before Tuesday's activity, and affection for the family's online posts. On September 27th, 2 days before he died, he wrote again. The week had been busy. He had been preparing for Venturer Camp. Berit had been baking raisin bread. The camp went well. 6 venturers came with 2.5 leaders. The boys were asleep early, and Art and Tim Shaver had a peaceful couple of hours by the fire. He came home, showered, spoke at a baptism, went to a family birthday dinner, and that evening drove around with Berit trying to photograph the super blood moon through the smoggy Fraser Valley air. The letter is full of motion and service and small pleasures, right to the end. Chapter 13, The Last Evening. Brodie McDermott's report gives the sequence of Tuesday evening, September 29, 2015. The scouts were outside working on match and fire permits. Art came out and presented each boy with the knife permit he had earned the week before. After that, he went back inside the church. 5 or 10 minutes later, Michael Davis came for Brodie and said there was an emergency inside. Brodie ran in and found Art slumped back in a chair in the foyer. He was not breathing and had no pulse. They called 911. Tim Shaver and Mike Judd started CPR. Brodie moved to secure the youth in different rooms, trying to make sure each group had a leader or parent with them. The fire department arrived and took over CPR. Paramedics followed, and the effort continued for another 30 to 40 minutes. Berit was alerted and came to the church. Around 8:30 or 9, a paramedic told her they had discontinued CPR and that Art was dead. Brodie added one more detail. 3 boys, Eli Haddad, Isaac Shaver, and Joshua Giesbrecht, were the ones who first found Art in the chair and knew something was wrong. They went to get Michael Davis. It is hard to imagine a more fitting final scene for Art than this one, and it should be written plainly, without ornament. He had spent decades showing up for boys and young men, in scouts and at church, often outside his comfort zone, often in small practical acts that mattered more than they announced themselves to be. On his last evening, he was doing exactly that. Epilogue: What endured. Art began his diary hoping that one day he could look back, remember the times he had gone through, and smile. He also hoped that his experiences might be of some value to others. Read across the years, the value is not only in the major turns, it is in the persistence of attention. He kept noticing his own faults and trying to correct them. He kept working. He kept serving. He kept recording weather, debts, gardens, children, callings, worries, jokes, meals, trips, and the people he loved. He did not wait for life to become grand before treating it as worth writing down. That is the strongest pattern the journals and letters leave behind. A life made by repetition, not performance. Faith was practiced in callings and in self-scrutiny. Love was practiced in rides, visits, letters, and steady labor. Stewardship was practiced in homes, boys' accounts, gardens, and weeks that looked unremarkable until they accumulated into a life. His last days did not contradict that pattern. They completed it.